She walked into that penthouse carrying two things that could have changed everything: a pair of tiny white baby shoes and a photograph of a heartbeat that wasn't hers alone. Isabella Marlowe believed she was bringing her husband the greatest news of their lives. Instead, she found the truth he had been hiding behind silk and power and the kind of smile that costs nothing to fake. What she heard through that half-open door didn't just break her heart, it ended her. And the most terrifying part, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply disappeared and took his future with her. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The elevator doors opened at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Isabella Marlowe stepped onto the 42nd floor of the Veyron Tower carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy and a weight in her chest she hadn't yet learned how to name. She wasn't supposed to be here. Lorenzo had been explicit about that, the way he was explicit about most things. Calm, even. The kind of voice that doesn't raise itself because it has never needed to. The penthouse is for work, Isabella. It's not personal. It's just clean. You. Understand? And she had understood, or told herself she did, the way she had learned to understand so many things inside the 4 years of knowing him and the 2 years of being his wife. You adjusted. You were accommodated. You found the edges of what was permitted and you stayed inside them, because stepping over meant dealing with a silence that was somehow worse than being shouted at. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was carrying a photograph of something impossibly small, a curve of spine and a flicker of heartbeat on a grainy ultrasound printout, and a pair of white baby shoes no bigger than her palm that she had bought on impulse from the pharmacy display rack because she hadn't known what else to do with the joy cracking through her ribs. She needed to tell him. She needed to see his face in the moment she told him. Needed the real-time truth of it, whatever that truth turned out to be. She had her key card. He had never asked for it back. The hallway on 42 was lit low and quiet, the kind of expensive quiet that costs more per square foot than most people earn in a month. Isabella's heels were soft on the marble. She was careful about that without meaning to be. Careful, the way you get when you live near someone whose moods you've learned to read from the sound of his footsteps. She was 20 feet from the office door when she heard his laugh. It stopped her the way a hand across the chest stops you. Not because Lorenzo Veyron never laughed. He did in controlled doses at the right moments, a social instrument, precisely deployed. But this was different. This was low and easy and unguarded, and she had never heard that particular register from him in the 2 years they'd been married. Not once, not even in the quiet hours after midnight when the city went to sleep, and she'd believed they were as close as two people could get. The office door was open 3 in. Later, she would not be able to explain why she didn't announce herself. Maybe some interior part of her already knew. Maybe the body understands things the mind hasn't caught up to yet, and her body had simply stopped her feet and made her breathe shallow and made her stand still in the hallway, like a woman waiting for a verdict that had already been delivered. Through the 3-in gap, she could see the edge of his desk, the blue glow of a monitor, the pale gold of the side lamp. She could see Vanessa Vale, standing close enough to Lorenzo that no reasonable professional distance remained between them. Vanessa, who had been his personal assistant for 6 years. Vanessa, who knew the accounts and the aliases, and the legal architecture of everything Lorenzo Veyron touched. Vanessa, whose efficiency Isabella had always respected from a safe and formal distance. Vanessa, who was now leaning with her shoulder against Lorenzo's chest while he rested one hand on the edge of the desk and smiled down at her in a way that made the hallway tilt. She still has no idea. Vanessa said it wasn't a question. Isabella isn't built for this world. Lorenzo's voice was the same voice he used to tell her good. Morning level, unbothered. She's exactly what I needed. The right name, the right face, the right amount of quiet. She doesn't ask the questions. That would require complicated answers. And when she finally does ask, she won't. He said it the way you say 2 plus 2. Mathematical already. Solved. She's too well-mannered, too afraid of what she might find. That's the whole point of her. The paper bag crinkled slightly in. Isabella's grip. She went still again, that reflex of stillness that had gotten her through years of difficult rooms. The baby shoes inside the bag were small enough to fit in one hand. She was aware of them the way you're aware of something fragile you're holding over a long drop. Vanessa said something else softer, and Isabella didn't catch it. And Lorenzo laughed again, that unguarded low laugh, and Isabella took 3 careful steps backward down the hallway the way she had come. She did, not run. Running would have required a destination. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She stood with her back straight and her hands around the paper bag and her breathing controlled and even. And when the elevator doors closed in front of her, she watched her own reflection for the 11 seconds it took to reach the lobby. And she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Not because she looked destroyed, because she looked completely, terrifyingly calm. It would be 4 hours before the calm cracked, and when it did, it was not in the way she expected. There was no collapse. There was no wreckage. She sat at the kitchen table of their apartment on the 31st floor with the paper bag in front of her and the ultrasound printout on the table and the baby shoes beside it, and she cried for exactly 12 minutes, ugly and silent, with both hands flat on the tabletop. Then she stopped, wiped her face, and began to think. She thought with the kind of clarity that only arrives after something essential in you has been severed cleanly. She thought about everything she had learned in 2 years of living inside. The architecture of Lorenzo Veyron's world. She thought about the names and the account structures and the shell companies she had once asked about casually, and he had explained too much, underestimating her. The way powerful men often underestimate the women they've decided are decorative. She thought about the attorney she had met at a charity event 8 months ago, a woman, sharp, family law, who had pressed a card into Isabella's hand and said, "If you ever need anything, no judgment. Call me first," with a directness that had seemed strange at the time and now made perfect sense. She put her hand on the ultrasound photo. She was not going to let this child grow up as another piece in someone's chess set. She was not going to let this child learn that love was something you performed for strategic reasons, that marriage was a cover story, that the most important thing in a family was how it appeared from the outside. Not this child, not hers. She made 2 decisions that night. The first was that she would not confront Lorenzo, not yet, and possibly not ever, because a confrontation would give him the chance to manage the situation, to deploy the level voice and the mathematical calm and the explanation that would somehow leave her feeling unreasonable for being the one who was hurt. The second decision was simpler and more terrifying. She was going to leave, and she was going to do it right, and she was going to give herself enough time to do it safely. She folded the ultrasound photo and put it in her coat pocket. She put the baby shoes in the inner pocket of her bag against her ribs. Then she went to bed and lay still in the dark for a long time, listening to the city 41 floors below, thinking about what she needed to do first. The next 3 weeks, Isabella moved like she was underwater. She went to charity lunches. She smiled at the right moments. She came home in the evenings and made the right sounds in the right rooms and touched Lorenzo's arm when he passed, and he touched hers in return. That automated tenderness of people whose marriage is a habit, and she felt nothing except a steady, cold clarity working its way through her system, like a slow tide going out. She called the attorney on a Thursday from a payphone in a coffee shop 11 blocks from their building. "I need to move money without him seeing it happen." The attorney said, "Tell me what you have access to. More than he thinks." There was a pause. "Good. Come in. Tomorrow. Use the side entrance." She went. She brought documents she had, photographed carefully over the preceding weeks. Not theft, nothing. Illegal, simply information she had a right to as his legal spouse, documentation of her own financial position, traces of accounts that had. Her name attached, even if she'd never touched them. The attorney was. Precise and thorough, and asked questions without blinking. And Isabella answered all of them without the self-consciousness she might once have. Felt. She was not the woman from 6 months ago. Something had cauterized. Inside her. She filed for divorce quietly on a Friday morning through, channels she had been coached to use without drama and without warning. And without asking for more than was legally hers. She took nothing that belonged to him. She had never wanted what was his. She had only ever wanted what she'd believed they were building together. And that thing, she now knew had never existed. The day before she left, she walked through the apartment one final time. She touched the edge of the kitchen counter. She stood at the window and looked out at the city. She picked up a photograph from the side table, the two of them at their wedding, Lorenzo in a dark suit, her in a dress that had taken 6 months to choose, and she looked at his face in it for a long time. This man she had loved without reservation, this man who had used that love the way you use a tool and set it down when the work is done. She put the photograph face down and walked out. She took a cab to the train station, and then another cab from the train station to a building in a part of the city where nobody knew her name. She had rented the apartment under her maiden name, Crane Isabella Crane, a name she hadn't used in 4 years, and paid 3 months in advance in cash. She had a bag, she had her documents, she had the attorney's number and a bank account. Lorenzo didn't know existed, and a child growing quietly inside her that she had not yet told a single person about except the doctor who'd taken the ultrasound. The apartment was small. The heating groaned. The window looked out at a fire escape and a strip of grey sky. She sat on the edge of the mattress the first night and put both hands on her stomach and talked to the child the way people sometimes talk in empty rooms, not expecting an answer, just needing to say it out loud. "I'm going to do this right," she said. "I don't know exactly how yet, but I'm going to do this right." She did not know that on the 42nd floor of Veyron Tower, her key card had triggered a security log that Lorenzo would not notice for 11 more days. She did not know that when he finally pulled the footage and saw her walking into his building and then back out 11 minutes later, with the paper bag pressed to her chest, he would stand completely still in front of the monitor for a long time, saying nothing, while the marble quiet of his penthouse became something different, became the sound of a man beginning to understand too late what he had allowed to slip through his hands. She did not know any of that yet. All she knew was the weight of the baby shoes in her coat pocket and the grey strip of sky outside the fire escape and the long, difficult, entirely hers road beginning in front of her. She got up. She unpacked the bag. She made herself a cup of tea with the small kettle the apartment came with, and she stood at the window holding it with both hands until the city went dark. And somewhere in that darkness, a man with power over everything except the one thing that mattered was about to start making mistakes. But those mistakes belonged to tomorrow. Tonight was hers. She turned off the light and let the quiet hold her. And for the first time in 2 years, the quiet felt like something she had chosen rather than something she had been assigned. She didn't know yet that Marco Ryland had already been given her description. She didn't know that the best tracker in Lorenzo's network was sitting in a car 3 neighborhoods, over, methodical and patient, working a list of names backward from the date of the divorce filing. She didn't know that Lorenzo had not eaten a real meal in 4 days, or that Vanessa Vale had watched him pull that security footage 6 times in a row with an expression on his face that she had never seen before and couldn't name. What Isabella Crane didn't know, as she stood in her dark apartment with one hand on her stomach, and the city humming below her, was that the man, who had decided she was too well-mannered to ask dangerous questions, had finally asked. Himself, the one dangerous question he'd been avoiding since the footage rolled across his monitor. What was in that bag? And Marco Ryland, methodical and patient, parked 3 neighborhoods over, was about to find out. Marco Ryland had been doing this kind of work for 11 years, and the thing he had learned, the one lesson that separated the men who lasted from the men who didn't, was that you never started with the obvious. Most people, when they ran, made the same mistakes. They went to family. They went to friends. They used their own name at least once in the first 72 hours because the brain under stress defaults to what's familiar, and familiarity leaves tracks. The trick was not to chase the person. The trick was to chase the habit. He started with the attorney. It took him 4 days to find the name. A woman named Claire Sutton. Family. Law. Solo practice. Office on the 9th floor of a building on Callaway. Street with a side entrance that the building's exterior camera caught, at an angle too oblique to make faces, but good enough to catch the silhouette of a woman in a grey coat who moved the way Isabella Marlowe moved, deliberate and contained, like someone who had rehearsed the route. The filing had come through a shell of a shell, clean enough to make a first pass look like nothing, messy enough around the 3rd generation of documentation that Marco could see the seams. He didn't tell Lorenzo immediately. He sat with it for 24 hours because Lorenzo, in his current state, was not the Lorenzo who made good decisions, and Marco had learned the difference between the 2 men a long time ago. On the 5th day, he walked into the penthouse on 42 and set a single sheet of paper on the desk. Lorenzo looked at it for a long time without picking it up. She filed herself out, Marco said, clean. She didn't try to burn anything, didn't touch the main accounts, didn't reach out to any of your competitors. She just left. Lorenzo picked up the paper. His face did the thing it did when he was processing something he hadn't anticipated, a stillness, so complete it looked like he'd stopped. Breathing. She's pregnant, Marco said. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. Lorenzo set the paper down. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and Marco watched him from across the desk and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and Marco was smart enough to know it. How far along? Lorenzo said finally. Not a question. The inflection of a man confirming something he already suspected. 16 weeks. Based on what I could pull from the clinic records, she went in under Crane. Isabella Crane, her maiden name. Yes. Lorenzo turned from the window. His face had rearranged itself into something harder and quieter than what had been there a moment ago, and Marco recognized the shift because he had seen it before, had seen it every time Lorenzo moved from being caught off guard to being operational. It was not a good shift. It was the shift that had preceded some of the worst decisions Lorenzo Veyron had ever made. Find her, Lorenzo said. I know where she is. Then, why are you still standing there? Because I need to know what you want to happen when I do. The question sat in the air between them like something with weight. Lorenzo looked at him for a long moment. I want to talk to her. That's it. That's it. Marco held his gaze for another second, then nodded once. Give me until tomorrow morning. He found her on a Wednesday. She was coming out of a grocery store 2 blocks from the apartment building. No coat, just a dark sweater, a canvas bag over one shoulder, her hair pulled back the way she wore it when she wasn't expecting to see anyone. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. It was the tiredness of a person who has been carrying something heavy alone for long enough that they've stopped noticing the weight and started just noticing everything that makes the weight worse. Marco stayed in the car. He took a photograph. He texted it to Lorenzo, without comment. Then he sat and watched Isabella Crane walk down the block and disappear around the corner. And he thought about the 16 weeks. And he thought about the paper bag and the security footage. And He thought about the fact that she had not told a single person, not family, not friends, not a single name in her previous life. And he felt something he was not paid to feel and pushed it back down where it belonged. Lorenzo's response came 40 seconds later. Don't approach her. I'll go myself. Marco stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back. That's a bad idea, the response. I didn't ask. He drove back to Veyron Tower and went straight to Dante Riven's office on the 28th floor because something had been bothering him for 10 days and he had not yet identified what it was. And in Marco's experience, the thing bothering you that you can't identify is almost always the thing that matters most. Dante was 26, sharp in the way that young men who grew up with nothing and suddenly found themselves adjacent to power tended to be sharp, fast processing, socially calibrated, good at reading what a room wanted from him and delivering it. Lorenzo had brought him up, personally, which meant Dante owed everything he had to one man's judgment, which also meant if that man's judgment ever wavered, Dante's position wavered with it. Marco stood in the doorway of Dante's office and watched him for a moment before Dante looked up. You've been running search queries on Isabella Marlowe, Marco said, through the secondary system, the one you think doesn't log. Dante's expression moved through three things very quickly: surprise, recovery, and then a very deliberate calm that was too polished to be genuine. Lorenzo asked me to run background on her before the marriage, old records. That was 2 years ago. He wanted an update. He didn't ask me to do it. Maybe he has. Different people for different things. Marco. The way he said it, light, friendly, with just enough edge to make it a challenge without being a declaration, made Marco look at him for a long time with the kind of attention that made most people in this building uncomfortable. Sure, Marco said. Maybe. He left without another word, and Dante watched him go. And the moment the doorway was empty, Dante picked up his phone and held it without dialing for almost 30 seconds, looking at the screen, his jaw working slightly before he put it back down on the desk and turned to his monitor and stared at nothing. 3 floors up, Vanessa. Vale was having the kind of day that comes after several weeks of smaller days that have been quietly terrible. She had watched Lorenzo pull the security footage 12 times now. She had watched him stop eating properly, stop sleeping with any regularity, stop performing the rituals of normalcy that kept his world running smoothly. She had watched him send Marco after Isabella and received Marco's reports with the expression of a man absorbing information he doesn't know what to do with, which was an expression she had genuinely never seen on him before. She had also, in the 3 weeks since Isabella's disappearance, spent a significant amount of time examining her own conscience and had found it in worse condition than she'd expected. She hadn't meant for Isabella to hear. She hadn't even known Isabella was in the building. What she had meant, the honest truth of it, which she had been avoiding since the night it happened, was that she had been testing something. She had been testing whether Lorenzo, given the right moment and the right proximity, and the right amount of unguarded ease, would say out loud what she had always suspected, that the marriage was transactional, that Isabella was a function rather than a choice, that there was space in his world that might still belong to someone else. He had said exactly that. And in the cold clarity of the weeks following, Vanessa had been forced to sit with the fact that hearing it had not given her what she'd wanted, and that what she'd actually done was hand a woman carrying her husband's child the confirmation of her worst fears through a 3-in gap in a door. She didn't know about the pregnancy. Not yet. That information was still contained to Lorenzo and Marco did not share operational details with anyone except on a need-to-know basis, and Vanessa understood from the architecture of her own position that she was not going to be the first person who needed to know. What she did know was that something in the building had shifted, and that shift had a direction, and the direction was not good. She was thinking about this on Thursday afternoon when her desk phone rang and it was Dante Riven, asking her in a very casual voice whether Lorenzo had mentioned anything recently about changing the security access protocols on the secondary. Servers? No, she said. Why? Just housekeeping. Nothing important. He hung up before she could ask anything else, and Vanessa sat with the receiver in her hand for a moment, then put it down slowly and thought about the question and thought about Dante and thought about the fact that in 6 years of working for Lorenzo Veyron, she had developed a very finely calibrated instinct for when something in this building was wrong. And right now that instinct was making a sound like a fire alarm. In a building where everyone else was still asleep, she picked up her phone and texted Marco 3 words. Watch Dante Riven. Marco's response came 11 minutes later, which in Marco's language meant he had already been watching and was confirming rather than starting already on it. The problem with Lorenzo going to see Isabella himself was not that it was emotionally reckless, though it was. The problem was tactical. Isabella had left cleanly and quietly, which meant she had planned carefully, which meant she was not the woman Lorenzo had decided she was, which meant any approach that treated her like the woman Lorenzo had decided she would fail immediately and make everything worse. Lorenzo understood none of this, or understood it abstractly in the way that people understand things that don't yet feel real to them. He drove himself, which was the first sign that the evening was going to go badly. No driver, no Marco. He parked 2 blocks from the building. Isabella was in and sat in the car for 9 minutes with both hands on the wheel and the engine off, which Marco knew because Marco was 3 cars, back in a vehicle Lorenzo hadn't seen, because Marco had been doing this long enough to know when Lorenzo needed supervision he hadn't asked for. Lorenzo got out of the car. He walked the 2 blocks. He went into the building and found the apartment number from the mailbox directory. And Marco watched him disappear through the lobby door and checked his watch, and decided he would give it 15 minutes before he followed. It took 11. Isabella opened the door because she heard the knock and assumed it was her downstairs neighbor, a retired school teacher named Ruth, who sometimes brought food up on weekday evenings with a cheerfulness that Isabella had started to genuinely depend on. She was already half smiling when she opened the door and saw Lorenzo, and the smile went out of her face the way a light goes out. She tried to close the door. He put his hand against it. Not aggressive, no force, just the flat palm of a man making a point about the conversation not being over before it had started. "I'm not here to drag you anywhere," he said. "I just need 5 minutes. You don't get 5 minutes, Isabella. You don't get anything from me." Her voice was level, not shaking, not raised, level in a way that was somehow worse than either of those things. The way a closed door is more final than a slammed one. You made a decision about who I was and what I was worth, and I heard it and I'm done. You don't get to knock on my door now because the outcome of that decision is inconvenient for you. "The baby," he said. The word landed between them, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripple of it crossed her face for exactly 1 second before she controlled it. "Is mine," she said. "It's also don't." The word was a wall. Don't finish that sentence. Don't. Come in here with the language of possession when you don't even know. The first thing about what this has cost me. You want to talk about the baby? Then start by explaining to me why I should let the man who kept me like a prop anywhere near a child I intend to raise with honesty. Lorenzo had no answer for that. She watched him not have the answer, watched the machinery of him, the always present calculation, the management of outcomes stall out in real time. And for the first time, since that night in the hallway, she felt something that wasn't grief or fear or cold resolve. She felt something closer to recognition. This was the real man behind the penthouse and the marble quiet and the level voice. This was what he looked like when the management failed. "I know what I said," Lorenzo said finally. "I know what you heard." "Good. Then you Know why I'm standing here and not somewhere further away. You stayed in the city because I'm not afraid of you." He looked at her and something in his face moved that she didn't have a name for. "I'm not asking you to. Come back," he said. "Then what are you asking?" He opened his mouth, closed it. The Lorenzo Veyron, who had an answer for everything, was standing in a narrow hallway in a building that costs less per year than one of his car leases, and he had nothing. "I don't know yet," he said. It was possibly the most honest thing he had ever said to her, and she hated how much it landed. "Go home, Lorenzo." She closed the door. This time, he let it close. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the wood grain of the door, and then he walked back down the stairs and out through the lobby, and Marco was leaning against the car, 2 blocks away with his arms crossed and an expression that said everything without saying a word. "Don't," Lorenzo said. "Wasn't going to." "How long have you been here?" "Long enough." They stood in the street for a moment, the city noise filling the space between them, and Lorenzo looked up at the building's lit windows without being able to identify which one was hers. "She's not what I thought she was," he said. "No," Marco said. "She wasn't." The distinction sat there between them, past, tense and present, and Lorenzo heard it and said nothing and got in the car. What neither of them knew, what Marco, with all his operational care, had not yet caught, was that 40 minutes earlier, while Lorenzo was still sitting with both hands on the wheel, working up the will to walk into that building, a different car had been parked on the opposite end of the block. A car that had followed Lorenzo from Veyron Tower. A car that Dante Riven had arranged to be there, driven by a man who worked for Ray Calder, Lorenzo's oldest and most patient rival. A man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of vulnerability. A crime lord, distracted by personal wreckage, making unscheduled solo trips to a residential neighborhood, leaving his operation exposed at the seams, while he chased something that couldn't be managed or controlled. The man in Calder's car had photographed Lorenzo entering the building. He had photographed Marco waiting. He had photographed the address, the mailbox, the lobby door. He had sent everything to Dante Riven, who had forwarded it to Ray Calder with a single line of text. "She's here," and "He's unraveling. Now is the time." And in an office across the city, Ray Calder looked at the photograph of the building where Isabella Crane was, sleeping, and smiled the way a man smiles when someone else's loss becomes his leverage, and reached for his phone. Ray Calder was not a man who hurried. That was the thing about him that most people misread. They looked at his age, 53, grey at the temples, the kind of soft weight around the middle that comes from 2 decades of restaurant meetings and negotiated settlements, and they read slowness. They read complacency. They read a man who had gotten comfortable and therefore gotten dull. Lorenzo had made that mistake once early and had corrected it, and the correction had cost him 18 months of careful repair work on the Eastern distribution network. He had not made the mistake again, but Dante Riven was 26, and 26 does not yet understand that patience in a dangerous man is not the absence of aggression. It is aggression that is learned to wait. Calder looked at the photographs for a long time, the building, the mailbox directory visible through the glass lobby door, Lorenzo's car, parked 2 blocks over, which his man had caught at an angle that made the plates readable. Marco Ryland leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, that particular posture of controlled irritation that meant Lorenzo had done something Marco hadn't sanctioned. He set the photographs down and poured 2 fingers of bourbon and did not drink it immediately. Just let it sit on the desk while he thought. The pregnancy changed things. Not sentimentally. Calder had not gotten where he was by, letting sentiment redirect his thinking, but tactically. A pregnant woman living alone under a false name, estranged from a man with significant resources and significant enemies, was not just a loose thread. She was a pressure point. Apply the right pressure at the right Angle and the whole structure shifts. He picked up the phone and called Dante. She doesn't know anything, Dante said immediately, which told. Called her that Dante was nervous, and that nervous people talk too fast to. Fill space. She left before she could accumulate anything operationally. Useful. Lorenzo kept her insulated. I'm not interested in what she knows, Calder said. I'm interested in what he feels. A pause. What do? You want me to do? I want you to go see her, Calder said. You're young. You're not Marco. She has no reason to associate you with anything threatening. Go see her. Tell her whatever she needs to hear to make her afraid of Lorenzo. Another pause, longer this time. She's already afraid of him, Dante said. Then make her more afraid. I need her to run. If she runs, he follows. If he follows, he's not watching his own house. You. Understand? Yes, Dante. Calder's voice dropped half a register the way. It did when he wanted to make sure something stuck. Don't be creative. Don't improvise. Say exactly what I tell you to say and nothing else. I understand. He laid it out in 3 minutes. Dante listened and said nothing, which was the most disciplined thing Calder had ever heard him do. Then Dante said, what if she doesn't believe me? And Calder said, she will, and hung up. He picked up the bourbon and drank it slowly and thought about Lorenzo Veyron, who had once been the most composed man in. Any room he entered, coming apart at the seams over a woman in a small apartment with a groaning heater and a fire escape view. And Calder thought, this is what happens when you spend 20 years being untouchable. You forget that the things that can reach you are never thee. Things you defended against. They're always the things you dismissed. He smiled and poured another 2 fingers and began to wait. Isabella had not slept well since Thursday. It was not the insomnia of fear exactly. She had gotten past the worst of the fear in the first week when every sound in the stairwell made her breath go shallow and every unfamiliar car on the block snagged her attention like a fishhook. What she had now was something more granular and more exhausting. The inability to turn her mind off. The constant background processing of contingencies. The way her body had quietly rerouted its resources so that genuine rest felt like something that happened to other people. She was eating. She was taking the prenatal vitamins. She had found an two neighborhoods over who had taken her on without commentary and who had at the last. Appointment told her the baby was developing exactly as it should, which Isabella had held on to like something physical in the days since. The baby is fine. The baby is on track. Whatever else is happening in the adult world above and around this small growing life, the life itself is on track. She was making tea on Saturday morning when someone knocked on her door. Ruth, she thought. Ruth sometimes came on Saturdays with bread from the bakery on 5th. She set the kettle down and crossed to the door and opened it without thinking, still half in the haze of a bad night in, a morning that hadn't fully assembled itself yet. Dante Riven was not someone she recognized immediately. He was young, dark-haired, dressed in a jacket that was slightly too nice for the building, but not so nice that it would have read as wrong on the street. He had an open face, the kind that read as approachable, slightly worried, like someone who'd worked hard to look like someone you could trust. Mrs. Marlowe, he said, then correcting himself with a slight wince. Sorry, Miss Crane, I'm sorry to come here like this. Isabella's hand went to the door frame, not gripping it, just touching it the way you touch a wall in the dark. Who are you? She said. Not a question, a demand with the question. Mark removed. My name is Dante. I work for Lorenzo. I've been with the organization for 4 years, he paused. I'm not here because he sent me. He doesn't know I'm here. That's important. That's the whole point. She looked at him for a long moment. Every instinct she had was running a calculation she didn't have a name for, something below the level of thought, animal and fast. Say what you came to say, she said. She did not step back from the door. Dante looked at the hallway over. His shoulder, a performed gesture, she would think later, too deliberate, to be instinctive, and then looked back at her. He knows about the baby, Dante said. He knows how far along you are. He knows which clinic you've been using, and he stopped, swallowed, did something with his face that looked like reluctance. He's been talking to a family attorney. His attorney, not yours. His. The kettle began to whistle in. The kitchen behind her. She didn't move. He's going to file for custody, Dante said. Full custody. His attorney has already drafted the paperwork. The argument is going to be that you're financially unstable, living in unsuitable conditions, and that you concealed the pregnancy as an act of deliberate alienation. He said it the way someone says. Something they've rehearsed into sounding spontaneous. I'm not supposed to know this. I overheard it, but I couldn't not tell you. He treated. You like a piece on a board. You deserve better. You deserve to know. The kettle was still going. Isabella turned and walked to the kitchen and took it off the heat and set it down carefully, both hands, and stood with her back to the room for 4 full seconds. When she turned around, Dante was still in the doorway. Full custody, she said. That's what the filing is going to argue based on financial instability and the concealment. His attorney is going to frame the concealment as evidence of parental unfitness. Isabella looked at him. Her face was very still. She had learned in 4 years near Lorenzo how to make her face very still. And she was using that skill now not to manage him, but to manage herself, to keep the thing moving through her chest from reaching her. Expression. You've been with him 4 years, she said. Yes, and you're here because your conscience sent you. Something shifted in Dante's open face, barely perceptible. A tightening around the jaw, a micro adjustment, the kind that only registered if you'd spent 2 years, learning to read the small movements of a man who never showed you the large ones. I know how it sounds, he said. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to protect yourself. She nodded slowly. All right, she said. Thank you. He left. She closed the door. She stood with her, back against it, and her hands flat on the wood behind her, and breathed. Slow and deliberate, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, the way her doctor had told her, the way she'd been practicing since the 7th week when the anxiety had first started spiking in her sleep. Then she went to her phone and called Claire Sutton. Claire picked up on the 2nd ring. Has Lorenzo filed anything? Isabella said. Any custody motion, any family law action, anything with his attorney in the last 2 weeks? A pause. She could hear Claire typing. Nothing, Claire said. I have a watch on the docket. Nothing has been filed. Nothing has been initiated. If he were moving on custody, I would have seen it before it reached paper. Another pause. Why? What happened? Isabella stared at the wall, across the kitchen. The water she'd been about to make into tea was sitting in the kettle going cold. Someone from his organization just told me he's planning a custody filing, she said. Full custody, parental unfitness argument. The silence on Claire's end had a texture to it. That's not how Lorenzo's attorneys work, Claire said carefully. They're not custody attorneys, they're commercial litigators. If he were going to make a family law move, he'd need to bring in outside counsel, and that takes time. And that time leaves a trail, and I would see the trail. A beat. Isabella, someone fed you that. Information for a reason. Isabella closed her eyes. To make me run, she said. That would be my red. Yes. She opened her eyes. The kitchen was exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds ago. The kettle, the counter, the grey strip of sky outside, and something in her had fundamentally rearranged itself in the space of one phone call. The way a dislocated joint being set back into place is the same joint it was beforehand, completely different at the same time. Okay, she said. Thank you, Claire. She hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and thought about Dante, Riven's open face and his too deliberate glance over his shoulder, and the way he'd said he doesn't know I'm here with the exact inflection of someone who had practiced saying it. She thought about who else might want her to run, who would benefit from Lorenzo being destabilized and distracted, who might have someone inside Lorenzo's organization willing to be used as an instrument. She thought about the fact that she had given away her location. The Dante Riven now knew not just that she was in the city, but exactly which building, exactly which floor, exactly which door. She thought about what happened to pressure points when the wrong person found them. She picked up her phone again and was about to call Marco Ryland's number. She had it, had memorized it in the second year of the marriage out of some instinct for contingency she'd never fully examined, and then stopped, because Marco worked for Lorenzo, and calling Marco meant putting herself in Lorenzo's hands, and she had spent 3 months building a life that didn't require that. She put the phone down, picked it up again, put it down. Then her door opened. Knocked opened because Dante Riven had not, when he left, heard the latch catch behind him, and Isabella had not still running Claire's words through her head checked. He stepped back in quietly. He was alone. He was not performing anything anymore. The open, approachable face was gone, replaced by something flatter and more careful. The face of someone executing a plan rather than playing a role. "I need you to come with me," he said. "It's not a request. I'm sorry." Isabella stood up from the table. She did not step back. This was a thing she'd learned. You step back and you give a room, and the room becomes theirs. "You're going to take me somewhere," she said. "And then what? You hand me to Calder." The name landed on him like a slap. His composure held, but the edges of it went slightly ragged, and she watched him not deny it, and understood. She was right. "Lorenzo put you in danger by coming here," Dante said. "Calder already knew about you before I did. I didn't. This wasn't supposed to go this way." What was it supposed to be? "You were supposed to run, that's all." "You run," Lorenzo follows. "Calder gets 2 days with an unguarded operation and takes what he needs. And nobody gets." He stopped. "Nobody gets hurt," Isabella said. "That's what you were going to say." He didn't answer. "A pregnant woman in a car going to Ray. Calder," Isabella said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "is not nobody getting hurt. That's a hostage, Dante. That's a leverage play. Calder doesn't want me safe. Calder wants Lorenzo desperate." Something moved through Dante's face that might have been the beginning of the real thing. Not the performance, not the plan, but the actual recognition of what he'd put himself in the middle of. "He said it would be clean," Dante said. "They always say it'll be clean." He was close enough now that she could see his hands. He was not reaching for her. His hands were loose, at his sides, but tension ran through them the way tension runs through something that's been wound too tight for too long. Isabella thought about the baby. She thought about 17 weeks in a heartbeat on a grainy printout and the tiny shoes in the inner pocket of her coat hanging by the door. She thought about the fact that the only person who knew where she was, who was not currently standing 6 feet from her with a plan that had already gone wrong, was a woman named Claire, who she had spoken to 3 minutes ago. She thought about Lorenzo. She thought about every reason she had not to call him, and she thought about one reason that outweighed all of them, which was the child between them and the fact that the man 6 feet away from her was not going to listen to her reason, her way out of this. She took a breath. "I'll come with you," she said. Dante relaxed half an inch, not more, but she saw it. "But I need my coat," she said. "It's cold," he nodded. She crossed to the hook by the door, the coat hanging there, the baby shoes in the inner pocket, and she reached for it, and while her back was to him and the coat was in her hands, she pressed send on the text she had typed left-handed and one-eyed in 30 seconds while she was still sitting at the table. One word to Marco's number here, and the address auto-completed from the Last time she'd texted it to Claire. She put the coat on. She turned. Around. She looked at Dante Riven, who had betrayed the man who made him, and was now standing in her apartment with the consequences of that. Betrayal assembled around him like a room he couldn't find the door out of. "All right," she said. She walked toward him, and as she passed, through the doorway of her own apartment into the narrow hallway, she had come to know over 3 months of careful and solitary survival. She felt the baby shoes press against her ribs through the coat lining, and she thought, "I'm not doing this for him. I'm not doing this for the marriage or the name or the life I lost. I am doing this because the only thing that matters now is the 17 weeks, and I will burn every bridge I built and call in every debt I don't owe and stand next to a man I have every reason never to speak to again if that is what it takes to keep her safe." The elevator came. They got in. The doors closed and, in the mirror panel of the elevator, Isabella watched her own face, still controlled, the face of a woman who has made her decision. And she watched Dante beside her, his jaw tight, his hands still loose, a young man who had made a series of choices that each seemed small and was not. And she thought, Marco will come. Marco is good at his job. Marco will come, or Lorenzo will come, or both of them will come. And when they arrive, everything about this situation will change. What she did not know, as the elevator descended and Dante stared at the floor numbers, counting down, was that Marco had received her text 11 seconds after she sent it and was already moving, and that he had called Lorenzo before. He'd even reached his car, and that Lorenzo had picked up on the first ring, which he almost never did, and that the word Marco used, compromised, had sent Lorenzo out of the Veyron Tower lobby at a speed that the 2 men at the door had never seen from him before. What she also did not know was that Ray called her, informed by his man outside that the woman was being moved, had made a second call to a second man, instructing him that if Lorenzo Veyron showed up at the building before the transfer was complete, the situation was to be resolved in the manner that left the fewest complications. The elevator doors opened. Onto the lobby. Dante put his hand on her arm, not rough, almost apologetic, and guided her toward the glass front door. And through the glass, she could see the street and the afternoon light and a black car she didn't recognize parked directly in front with its engine running. And she understood that whatever was coming next was going to happen in the next 4 minutes, whether she was ready for it or not. The glass door was cold under Isabella's hand. She pushed through it, and the afternoon hit her. The wind off the street, the exhaust, smell of the idling black car, the particular quality of city light in late October that makes everything look slightly more real than it should. Edges too sharp, colors too specific, the way things look when your body has made the executive decision that this is a moment you will remember and has turned the resolution all the way up. Dante's hand was still on her arm, not gripping, guiding. The distinction mattered to her. In a way she couldn't have explained. It meant he was still performing. The role of someone who had a plan, which meant the plan had not yet entirely collapsed, which meant there was still a window between now and the black car where something could change. She counted 3 steps from the lobby door to the sidewalk. On the second step, the black car's front passenger door opened, and a man got out who was not called her, and was not anyone she recognized, but who had the particular build and the particular economy of movement that she associated from 4 years, of peripheral observation with men who were paid specifically for situations that required them to be larger than the problem. On the third step, she heard tires, not the black car, something else coming, fast from the left. And Dante heard it too because his hand tightened on her arm for the first time, actual grip, and he turned toward the sound, and she felt him tense through the contact of his hand on her arm. The way you feel a vibration through a wall. Marco's car came around the corner at a speed that was not legal and not subtle and did not need to be either. and it stopped at an angle that blocked the black car from the street. Not precisely, but enough. The way a body thrown in a doorway doesn't have to fill it perfectly to slow what's coming through. Marco was out before the car had fully stopped. He moved the way he always moved. No wasted motion, nothing telegraphed, the flat efficiency of someone for whom physical situations were a professional category rather than an emergency. And he put himself between Isabella and the man from the black car and said nothing at all. The man from the black car looked at him. "Walk away," Marco said. "Can't do that. You can. You're making a choice right now about who you want to have a problem with. Choose carefully. 3 seconds. The man looked at Marco's hands, which were loose and ready at his sides. He looked at the angle of Marco's body. He looked at whatever it was in Marco's face that men who do this kind of work learn to read, and other men who do this kind of work. He got back. In the car, Dante had gone completely still. Isabella felt it through, his hand on her arm, the full body stillness of someone whose plan has just been structurally compromised and who is rapidly calculating what the new situation requires. She pulled her arm free. He let her go. That was the most important thing. He let her go, which meant whatever calculation he was running had just concluded that holding on to her was a cost he couldn't afford. She stepped toward Marco, and Marco looked at her once, a quick, thorough look, the look of someone taking inventory, and then looked back at Dante. "Get in the car," Marco told Isabella. "Lorenzo, he's 3 minutes out. Get in the car." She got in the car. Through the windshield, she watched Marco and Dante face each other on the sidewalk. She couldn't hear what they said. She watched Dante's open face do something she hadn't seen it do before. It closed. Whatever was left of the performance fell away, and what was underneath was younger and more frightened than anything that had been visible before. A 26-year-old who had made a catastrophic miscalculation and was standing in the full light of it. Marco took out his phone, made a call, kept his eyes on Dante. Dante did not run. Isabella thought about that later, the fact that he didn't run, and concluded that he understood on some essential level that running was no longer a category of option available to him. That the moment Marco's car had come around that corner, the map of possible futures had reduced to a very small number of rooms, and none of them had exits in the direction he'd been planning to go. Lorenzo arrived in 2 minutes, not 3. He pulled up behind Marco's car, the same car from Thursday, no driver, and he got out and looked at the street, the black car, Marco, Dante, the angle of everything. And his face did the thing it did when he was processing a scene rapidly, reading the spatial relationships and the body language, and the residue of what had already happened, assembling it into a sequence. She watched him do it through the windshield. She watched the moment he understood. He looked at Dante. Whatever Lorenzo Veyron felt, in that moment, it did not reach his face. His face was the face he wore. In rooms where loss of control was not permitted, his face was the 42nd floor, the marble quiet, the 2+2 voice, and yet something in the set of his jaw and the particular stillness of his hands at his sides communicated something that bypassed the face entirely. Something that went straight to the animal part of the brain that knows the difference between a man who is angry and a man who is dangerous. He walked to Dante. He stopped 2 feet away. "Tell me," he said. His voice was level. It was the most frightening version of his voice. Dante told him. Not everything. Not yet. Not with the street around them and the black car still at the curb, but enough. Called his name, the plan, what he'd told Isabella and why. He spoke in a flat, rapid monotone, the voice of someone making a confession that is passed beyond strategy into something more basic, the simple animal need to stop carrying the weight of it. Lorenzo listened without moving. When Dante stopped talking, Lorenzo was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Get in Marco's Car. Lorenzo, don't talk. Get in the car. Dante got in Marco's car. Lorenzo came to the passenger side of his own car and opened the door and looked at Isabella. And for a moment, neither of them said anything. The street noise filling the space between them. A cab horn somewhere. The wind. The particular urban silence that is not silence at all, but the accumulation of 1,000 small sounds that cancel each other out. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," he nodded, got in the driver's side, sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. "I need to deal with Calder," he said. "I know. That means tonight. It can't wait." "I know, Lorenzo." He looked at her then, and whatever was in his face was not the 42nd floor and was not the marble quiet. It was something raw and less, managed and more real. The face she'd glimpsed for 1 second in her apartment doorway when she'd asked him what he was asking for, and he'd said, "I don't know yet. I need you somewhere safe while I do," he said. "I can go to Claire's." "Who's Claire?" "My attorney." Something moved in his face. Not quite a W, Zez. The acknowledgement of a thing that had a shape he hadn't expected. "All right," he said. "I'll take you." There first, he started the car. He pulled out around the black car, which had not moved. The man inside it, having made his calculation and was now presumably on the phone with Calder describing how the afternoon had gone. And Lorenzo gave it one long look as he passed and then looked back at the road and drove. They were 6 blocks from Claire's building. When Isabella said, "He told me you were filing for custody," Lorenzo's hands moved on the wheel, an adjustment barely visible. "He told you I was filing for full custody," he said, "on grounds of parental unfitness." "Yes." "And you believed it?" She looked at him for about 3 minutes. "Then I called my attorney." He was quiet for a moment. 3 minutes? He said it was. "A credible story, Lorenzo. It fit everything I already believed about you." The car stopped at a red light. He stared through the windshield at the cross-traffic. "I know," he said. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the line of his mouth, the thing he was doing with his hands on the wheel. That was the closest she had ever seen to him, not being in control of what his hands were doing. She thought about the 3 minutes she had stood in her kitchen with Claire's words dismantling Dante's story. And she thought about the fact that the story had been credible, not because Dante had been skilled, but because she'd had 2 years of evidence for it, because it had fit the man she'd believed. She'd married. The light changed. He drove. They didn't speak again until he pulled up in front of Claire's building. "I'm going to end this tonight," he said. "By doing what?" "By talking to Calder directly," she looked at him. "I'm not going in armed," he said. "That's not what this is. Calder is a businessman. He moved on me because he saw an opening. I'm going to close the opening. Negotiation, a new agreement, something that removes his incentive to use you as leverage." He paused. "It's the only play that doesn't turn into something worse. And Dante has a separate problem. He's 26. Lorenzo, I know how old he is. I was there when he was 22 and had nothing." The flatness in his voice was not cold. It was something more complicated than cold. "That doesn't change what he did." She looked at her hands in her lap, the coat, the inner pocket where the baby shoes pressed against her ribs. "No," she said. "It doesn't." She got out of the car. He didn't move to stop her. She was 3 steps from the car when she turned back. "Lorenzo," he looked at her through the open door. "Come back," she said. "Not be. Careful. Not I forgive you. Not any of the things that would have required her to be further along than she was. Just that. Come back." The minimum true thing she had available. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and drove. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the car until it was gone. And then she went inside. Ray Calder's office was on the 14th floor of a building that housed a legitimate import. consulting firm on the floors below and several things that were not, that on the floors above. Lorenzo had been in the building once before, 7 years ago, for a meeting that had established the original terms of a non-interference agreement that had held imperfectly but functionally for most of the time since. He remembered the elevator. He remembered the way the carpet on 14 was slightly nicer than the floors below it. He remembered Calder's assistant, a different one now, a woman with short, grey hair who looked at him with no expression whatsoever and said, Mr. Calder is expecting you," which meant Calder had known he was. Coming before Lorenzo had called, which meant Calder had resources. Watching Veyron Tower, which was not a surprise and was still unpleasant, to confirm. The office was large and warm and smelled like old wood and the particular staleness of rooms where serious conversations have been conducted for a long time. Calder was behind his desk. He did not stand. When Lorenzo came in, Lorenzo sat down without being invited. The assistant closed the door behind him. "Dante's in custody," Lorenzo said. "Whatever he sold you, I know what it is. Whatever advantage you thought you were buying, the shelf life on it is roughly 12 hours from now. I want to talk about what comes next." Calder looked at him with the unhurried attention of a man who has never needed to perform urgency. "You drove here yourself," Calder said. "No security, no posturing." He tilted his head slightly. "That's either very confident or very stupid. It's neither. It's practical. I'm here to negotiate, not threaten. Threatening requires leverage, and tonight we both know your leverage." Walked out of a building in Marco Ryland's car. Calder was quiet for a moment. "The woman is fine. The woman is fine. Good." And the thing was, the maddening, disorienting thing was that he seemed to mean it. "I don't make war on pregnant women, Lorenzo. That was always going to be a pressure play, not an end game. I needed you off balance, not bereaved. You needed me distracted. I needed you human." Calder picked up the bourbon glass from the corner of his desk. "You've been running that operation like a machine for 6 years. No visible weakness, no personal. Stakes, nothing to press on. And then your wife walks out carrying your child and you start driving yourself to residential neighborhoods at night without telling your security chief. And suddenly you're comprehensible." He paused. "Comprehensible men are easier to work with." Lorenzo looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want?" Lorenzo said. "Access to the harbor logistics on the south end. 3 shipments a quarter, my cargo, your infrastructure, fair rate, clean paper. The South End has obligations that you can renegotiate. You're good at renegotiating." Calder set the glass down. "I'm not trying to take your operation, Lorenzo. I'm 63 years old. I'm tired of building things from the ground up. I want to use what already exists." "That's a different ask. And in return, Dante Riven's usefulness to me ends immediately. Whatever he told me, I'll have my people confirm. Independently, and then destroy the copies. You handle your internal problem your own way." He paused, and I stopped looking at your personal life as a strategic resource. The room was very quiet. Somewhere below them, the building hummed with its own legitimate business. The floors of import consulting and whatever else, the machinery of a city that did not know or care what was being agreed to on the 14th floor. Lorenzo thought about Isabella standing on the sidewalk outside Claire's building, saying, "Come back," in the voice of someone offering the minimum true thing they had available. He thought about 17 weeks in a heartbeat and a pair of baby shoes he had never seen, but could picture, with a specificity that made the back of his throat ache. He thought about what it meant to make this agreement, the South End. Infrastructure, the ongoing relationship with a man who had just used